You think you've seen everything the Georgia auction blocks have to offer, but wait until you hear about the day they sold the most beautiful and most feared slave woman in the state's history, because what happened next changed everything for one unsuspecting plantation owner. The morning sun cast long shadows across Savannah's slave market as an unusual crowd gathered. Word had spread through the Georgia lowlands like wildfire. Today's auction featured something extraordinary. Plantation owners who rarely left their estates had traveled hundreds of miles. Whispered conversations filled the humid air, all centered on one name, Alika. Thomas Whitmore adjusted his wide-brimmed hat, studying the assembled crowd with calculating eyes. As one of Georgia's most successful cotton planters, he'd attended countless auctions, but never had he seen such anticipation. Nervous energy crackled through the gathering like electricity before a thunderstorm. "Gentlemen, settle yourselves," called Jeremiah Cobb, the auctioneer, his voice cutting through the murmur. "Today we present a most exceptional offering." The crowd fell silent as a figure emerged from the holding quarters. Alika moved with fluid grace despite the iron shackles around her ankles. Her dark skin seemed to absorb and reflect the morning light simultaneously, creating an almost ethereal glow. High cheekbones framed eyes that held depths Thomas had never encountered. Ancient, knowing, and utterly unafraid. But it wasn't just her striking beauty that commanded attention. Something else emanated from her presence, something that made seasoned slave traders shift uncomfortably and cross themselves when they thought no one was looking. 20-year-old female, strong constitution, no known illnesses, Cobb announced, though his usual confidence seemed forced. Bidding starts at $300. The opening bid shattered records before the first minute passed. Thomas watched, fascinated, as plantation owners bid with desperate intensity, as if acquiring her meant securing something far more valuable than labor. "800, shouted Colonel Morrison from Charleston. 900, countered Judge Hartwell. Thomas noticed how Alika's gaze swept the crowd, not with the defeated resignation he'd seen in countless other slaves, but with the measured assessment of someone cataloging threats. When her eyes briefly met his, he felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine. $1,000! The bid came from Marcus Beauregard, whose family controlled half the rice plantations along the coast. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. $1,000 could buy 3 prime field hands or a skilled craftsman. For a single woman, it was unprecedented. But Thomas found himself raising his hand. $1,200. The crowd turned toward him in shock. Beauregard's face flushed red with anger and disbelief. Even Cobb seemed momentarily speechless. $1,200, the auctioneer repeated slowly. "Do I hear 13? Silence stretched like a taut rope. Beauregard opened his mouth, then closed it, shaking his head. Other potential bidders looked away, suddenly finding their boots fascinating. "Sold to Mr. Thomas Whitmore for $1,200. As the gavel fell, Thomas caught something in Alika's expression. Not gratitude or relief, but what looked almost like satisfaction, as if events were unfolding exactly as she'd expected. The paperwork took an hour to complete. During that time, Thomas overheard fragments of conversation that made his stomach tighten with unease. 3 previous owners, all dead within a year. Strange markings found burned into the barn walls. The old woman said she carries the bloodline. When he approached to claim his purchase, the slave trader pulled him aside. "Mr. Whitmore, I feel obligated to mention certain irregularities in this woman's history." "What kind of irregularities?" The man glanced around nervously. Her previous owners experienced unusual difficulties. "Livestock deaths, crop failures, unexplained accidents. Some folks say she's cursed." Thomas laughed, though it sounded forced even to his own ears. Superstitious nonsense. I deal in cotton and commerce, not folklore. But as they loaded Alika into his wagon for the journey to Whitmore Plantation, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just purchased something far more complex than he'd bargained for. The other slaves in his wagon pressed themselves against the far side, leaving a careful circle of space around her. During the 3-hour ride through Georgia's pine forests, Alika remained perfectly still, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She didn't speak, didn't acknowledge his attempts at conversation, didn't even seem to notice the oppressive heat that had the other slaves sweating profusely. As they approached his plantation, Thomas felt a strange anticipation building in his chest. Whitmore Plantation, had been in his family for 3 generations, a model of efficiency and order. Nothing ever happened there that he didn't plan and control. But as the wagon rolled through the front gates, a murder of crows erupted from the oak trees lining the drive, their harsh cries filling the air like a warning. Alika's lips curved into the faintest suggestion of a smile. That evening, as Thomas reviewed his ledgers in his study, he tried to convince himself that purchasing Alika had been a sound business decision. $1,200 was steep, but her obvious intelligence and bearing suggested she could be trained for housework, perhaps even as a personal servant for his wife when she returned from Charleston. Outside his window, the slave quarters were unusually quiet. No singing, no conversation, just an oppressive silence that seemed to press against the glass. Thomas found himself glancing toward the small cabin where he'd housed Alika, though he couldn't say why. Around midnight, he was awakened by the sound of his livestock in distress. Horses whinnied frantically in the stables, cattle lowed in panic, and his prized hunting dogs howled as if they'd seen something that terrified them to their cores. Thomas grabbed his rifle and stepped onto the front porch. The night was perfectly still, with no wind to explain the animals' agitation. Moonlight painted the plantation grounds in silver and shadow, revealing nothing unusual. But as he stood there, listening to the gradually subsiding animal sounds, Thomas noticed something that made his blood run cold. Every single light in the slave quarters had been extinguished, except for the faint glow coming from Alika's cabin window. And in that window, he could swear he saw the silhouette of a woman standing perfectly still, as if she were watching him watch her. The next morning would bring discoveries that would shatter Thomas Whitmore's understanding of everything he thought he controlled. But for now, he stood on his porch, rifle in hand, staring at that distant window and wondering what exactly he'd brought into his carefully ordered world. If you thought buying the most feared slave in Georgia was Thomas Whitmore's biggest mistake, wait until you see what happened on her first night at the plantation, because some secrets refused to stay buried. Dawn broke gray and oppressive over Whitmore Plantation, but Thomas had barely slept. The previous night's animal disturbances had left him on edge, and every shadow seemed to hold potential threats. As he dressed, he tried to rationalize the events. Perhaps a predator had wandered too close, or the animals had simply sensed the newcomer's presence. But rational explanations felt increasingly hollow as he stepped outside and surveyed his domain. The first sign that something was wrong came from his overseer, Jake Morrison, who approached with uncharacteristic hesitation. Morrison had managed difficult slaves for 15 years and feared nothing, but this morning his hands trembled as he removed his hat. "Mr. Whitmore, sir, we got ourselves a situation." "What kind of situation?" Morrison gestured toward the main house. "Best you see for yourself." Thomas followed him around the corner and stopped dead. Carved deep into the white-painted wood of his front door was a symbol he'd never seen before, a complex pattern of interlocking circles and lines that seemed to shift and writhe when he looked at it directly. The carving was fresh, wood shavings still scattered on the porch boards. "When did this happen?" "Sometime during the night, sir. None of the house slaves heard anything, and I had men patrolling until dawn." Thomas ran his fingers over the carved symbol. The lines were perfectly precise, cut with surgical accuracy. Who could have done this without being seen? Morrison's face went pale. "Sir, there's more." They walked to the slave quarters, where Thomas discovered identical symbols carved into 3 different cabin doors, but not Alika's. Her door remained unmarked, while the symbols on the others seemed to point in her direction like accusatory fingers. "The slaves are spooked, Mr. Whitmore," Morrison continued. "Half of them are talking about running and the other half are praying like the world's ending." As if summoned by their conversation, old Mama Celia emerged from her cabin. At 73, she was the plantation's eldest slave and unofficial spiritual leader. Her weathered face held an expression Thomas had never seen before, genuine terror. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you need to send that woman away." "Excuse me? That woman you brought here. She ain't what she seems. The spirit's been restless all night, warning us." Thomas felt his patience wearing thin. "Mama Celia, I won't have superstitious nonsense disrupting my plantation. These symbols are the work of vandals, nothing more." But even as he spoke, he noticed how the other slaves had gathered at a respectful distance, their faces etched with fear. Children clung to their mothers' skirts. and the men who usually worked with confident efficiency now moved with nervous, darting glances. "Where is she now?" Thomas asked Morrison. "Still in her cabin, sir. Hasn't come out since last night." Thomas strode toward Alika's quarters, his boots crunching on the gravel path. The morning air felt thick and oppressive, as if a storm were approaching, though the sky remained cloudless. He knocked on the cabin door. "Alika, come out. We need to discuss your duties." Silence. He knocked harder. "I'm speaking to you." The door opened slowly, revealing Alika in the simple grey dress provided to all female slaves. But somehow, on her, the rough fabric looked regal. Her dark eyes met his with that same unsettling directness he'd noticed at the auction. "You slept well?" he asked, studying her face for any sign of guilt or deception. "Yes, master." Her voice was melodious, with an accent he couldn't place, not quite African, not quite American, but something older and more complex. "Did you hear anything unusual during the night? Any disturbances?" The animals were restless. Sometimes they sense things humans cannot. Her answer sent an unexpected chill through him. "What kind of things?" Alika's gaze shifted to the carved symbols on the neighboring cabin doors. "Change coming, master. The old ways calling to the new." Before Thomas could respond, a commotion erupted from the direction of the cotton fields. Shouts and running footsteps drew his attention away from Alika's cryptic words. Morrison appeared, running toward them with panic written across his features. "Mr. Whitmore, you need to come quick." They hurried to the fields where a crowd of field hands had gathered around something in the dirt. As Thomas pushed through the group, he saw what had caused their distress. The cotton plants in a perfect circle, roughly 20 feet in diameter, had withered overnight. Not gradually, as plants do when diseased, but completely, as if the life had been drained from them in an instant. The soil within the circle was bone dry, despite the previous evening's humidity, and the same mysterious symbol from the cabin doors was pressed into the earth at the circle's center. "How is this possible?" Thomas whispered. One of the field hands, a man named Samuel who'd worked the plantation for a decade, stepped forward. "Mr. Whitmore, sir, my grandmother told stories about this kind of thing, said it happens when the old blood wakes up." "What old blood?" Samuel glanced nervously at the other slaves before continuing. "African blood, sir. The kind that remembers things from before the ships, before the chains. Some folks carry it stronger than others." Thomas felt the world tilting beneath his feet. He was a rational man, educated at the University of Georgia, versed in agriculture and commerce, but standing in that withered circle, surrounded by terrified slaves and inexplicable symbols, rationality felt like a luxury he could no longer afford. "Get back to work," he ordered, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "All of you." As the slaves dispersed, Thomas noticed that Alika had followed them to the fields. She stood at the edge of the withered circle, her expression unreadable. When she knelt and placed her palm against the dead earth, Thomas could have sworn he saw the faintest shimmer in the air around her hand. "What are you?" he asked quietly. Alika rose gracefully, brushing dirt from her palm. "I am what you purchased, master. Nothing more, nothing less." But her eyes held depths that suggested otherwise. Ancient knowledge, carefully guarded secrets, and something that looked almost like pity when she looked at him. That afternoon brought more disturbing discoveries. The plantation's well water had turned brackish overnight, forcing them to send slaves to the creek for drinking water. 3 of his best hunting dogs had disappeared without a trace, leaving only their collars arranged in a neat triangle near the kennels. And most unsettling of all, every mirror in the main house had developed hairline cracks that formed the same symbol now appearing throughout the plantation. As evening approached, Thomas found himself standing on his front porch, staring toward the slave quarters where Alika's cabin sat like a dark jewel among the others. Smoke rose from her chimney, though the night was warm, and occasionally he caught glimpses of shadows moving past her window, shadows that seemed too numerous for a single occupant. Morrison approached with the day's final report, his usual confidence completely shattered. "Sir, I've been thinking. Maybe we should consider selling her, cut our losses before things get worse." Thomas wanted to agree, but something held him back. Perhaps it was pride. He'd never been defeated by a slave before. Or perhaps it was curiosity about the mystery Alika represented. But deep down, he suspected it was something else entirely. The growing certainty that whatever was happening at his plantation was far bigger than one woman, and that sending her away might only delay the inevitable. "Double the night watch," he told Morrison, "and have the men carry torches. I want every inch of this plantation illuminated." As Morrison hurried away to implement the orders, Thomas remained on his porch, watching Alika's cabin. The smoke from her chimney had taken on an unusual color, not the gray-white of burning wood, but something deeper, almost purple in the dying light. And in that smoke, if he squinted just right, Thomas could swear he saw shapes forming and dissolving. Faces, perhaps, or symbols, or something else entirely that his rational mind refused to acknowledge. Tomorrow would bring revelations that would shatter his understanding of everything he thought he knew about the woman he'd purchased. But tonight, he stood guard over his plantation, rifle in hand, watching purple smoke rise into the Georgia sky and wondering what forces he'd unknowingly invited into his carefully controlled world. You think the strange symbols and withered crops were just the beginning? Wait until you discover what the plantation's eldest slave reveals about Alika's true identity, because some bloodlines carry secrets that can topple empires. The third morning at Whitmore Plantation dawned with an eerie stillness that made Thomas's skin crawl. No birds sang in the oak trees, no insects buzzed in the humid air, and even the ever-present Georgia wind had died to nothing. The silence felt oppressive, as if the very land were holding its breath. Thomas had spent another sleepless night patrolling his property, rifle in hand, watching for signs of whatever force was systematically dismantling his ordered world. The doubled guard had reported nothing unusual, yet 3 more circles of withered crops had appeared overnight, each one larger than the last, each one bearing that same inexplicable symbol pressed deep into the earth. But it was the discovery in his study that truly unnerved him. Every book on his shelves, volumes on agriculture, law, philosophy, and literature, had fallen open to the same page number, 144. When he tried to close them, they'd immediately fallen open again, as if invisible hands were turning the pages. "Mr. Whitmore?" Morrison's voice called from outside his study door. "Mama Celia's asking to speak with you. Says it's urgent." Thomas found the elderly slave woman waiting on his front porch, her weathered hands clutching a small cloth bundle. Her usual confident demeanor had been replaced by something he'd never seen in her before, genuine fear mixed with grim determination. "Mama Celia, what's so important it couldn't wait?" She glanced around nervously before speaking. "Mr. Whitmore, I've been keeping quiet, hoping things would settle, but they ain't settling. They're getting worse. And if I don't tell you what I know, we all gonna pay the price." "Tell me what?" "About that woman you bought, about who she really is." Thomas gestured toward 2 chairs on the porch. "Sit. Explain." Mama Celia settled herself carefully, the cloth bundle in her lap. "My grandmother was brought from Africa on the same ship as Alika's great-grandmother. Told me stories before she died. Stories I never thought I'd need to remember." "What kind of stories?" "About the keepers, Mr. Whitmore. In the old country, before the white men came with their ships, there were families chosen to guard ancient knowledge. Secrets about the land, about the spirits, about power that could free or destroy." Thomas felt his skepticism warring with the evidence of his own eyes. "Superstitious folklore, Mama Celia. Is it?" She unwrapped her bundle, revealing a piece of bark covered in symbols identical to those appearing around his plantation. "My grandmother carved this before she died. Said if I ever saw these marks again, it would mean a keeper had awakened." The bark felt warm in Thomas's hands, almost alive. The symbols seemed to shift and dance when he looked at them directly, making his vision blur. "Alika's bloodline goes back 7 generations to a woman named Aduni," Mama Celia continued. "She was the last keeper to leave Africa alive. The slave traders thought they were just taking another strong woman, but they were stealing something far more dangerous." "Dangerous how?" "The keepers weren't just guardians of knowledge, Mr. Whitmore. They were guardians of power. Power to heal, power to curse, power to break chains that weren't just made of iron." Thomas set the bark aside, his hands trembling slightly. "You're talking about magic. I'm talking about truth. And the truth is, every plantation that's owned a woman from Alika's line has fallen within a generation. Crops fail, families die, fortunes disappear. Not because of curses, but because the keepers remember what was stolen from them." "What was stolen?" Mama Celia's eyes grew distant. "Freedom, Mr. Whitmore. Not just their own, but the freedom of every soul bound in chains. The knowledge they carry isn't just about herbs and healing. It's about breaking systems, toppling kingdoms, setting the captives free. A chill ran down Thomas's spine as he remembered Alika's words from the previous day. Change coming, Master. The old ways calling to the new. You're saying she's planning some kind of rebellion? I'm saying she doesn't have to plan anything. The power in her blood calls to the power in others. Every slave on this plantation feels it, even if they don't understand what it is. And when enough of them answer that call, she didn't need to finish the sentence. Thomas could see it in his mind, his carefully controlled world crumbling, as his human property remembered they were human beings with the power to choose their own fate. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because my grandmother made me promise something before she died. She said if a keeper ever awakened, I should try to protect the innocent. You got a choice to make, Mr. Whitmore. You can try to fight what's coming, or you can try to understand it." Before Thomas could respond, a commotion erupted from the slave quarters. Shouts and running footsteps drew their attention toward Alika's cabin, where a crowd had gathered. Thomas and Mama Celia hurried over to find the slaves standing in a perfect circle around Alika's door, their faces upturned toward something above. Following their gaze, Thomas saw what had captured their attention. Every tree surrounding the cabin was blooming, not with their natural flowers, but with blossoms of deep purple and gold that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The impossible flowers released a fragrance unlike anything Thomas had ever experienced, sweet and complex and somehow familiar, as if it awakened memories he didn't know he possessed. "How is this possible?" he whispered. "The awakening," Mama Celia said softly. "It's beginning." Alika emerged from her cabin and Thomas saw immediately that something had changed. She moved with even greater grace than before, and her dark skin seemed to shimmer with the same inner light as the impossible flowers. When she looked at the gathered slaves, they straightened, as if responding to an unspoken command. "My people," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd despite its gentle tone. "Do you remember the songs your grandmothers sang? The stories they whispered when the masters weren't listening?" Murmurs of recognition rippled through the crowd. Old songs half remembered began to rise from various throats, melodies that seemed to harmonize with the very air itself. "The time of forgetting is ending," Alika continued. "The time of remembering has begun." Thomas felt something shift in the atmosphere around him, as if the fundamental nature of reality were being rewritten. The slaves no longer looked like his property. They looked like people awakening from a long dream, remembering who they had been before chains and whips and bills of sale had tried to convince them they were something less than human. "Stop this," Thomas said, his voice cracking with authority he no longer felt certain he possessed. "All of you, return to your quarters immediately." But for the first time in his life, his slaves didn't obey. They remained in their circle around Alika, their faces turned toward her like flowers following the sun. Alika's gaze found Thomas across the crowd. "Master Whitmore," she said, and somehow her voice reached him clearly despite the distance. "Your grandmother's grandmother owned my great-great-grandmother. Did you know that?" Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. His family's records went back generations, but he'd never paid attention to the genealogies of their human property. "The debt has been accumulating interest for a very long time," Alika continued. "But I am not here for revenge. I am here for balance." "What kind of balance?" "The kind that sets all things right." As if responding to her words, the impossible flowers began to fall from the trees like purple and gold snow. Where they touched the ground, the withered circles of crops began to turn green again, life flowing back into the dead earth. But Thomas barely noticed the miraculous healing. His attention was fixed on Alika's eyes, which held depths of knowledge and power that made him feel like a child, playing at being master of forces far beyond his comprehension. Mama Celia touched his arm gently. "The choice is coming, Mr. Whitmore, and it's coming soon." As the slaves began to disperse, still humming those ancient songs, Thomas remained frozen in place. He was beginning to understand that purchasing Alika hadn't been a business transaction. It had been the first move in a game whose rules he didn't understand and whose stakes were higher than he'd ever imagined. Tomorrow would bring discoveries that would force him to confront the true nature of the power he'd brought onto his plantation. But tonight, As purple and gold petals continued to fall like blessings or warnings, Thomas Whitmore stood at the crossroads between the world he'd always known and a future he couldn't begin to imagine. Think you understand what makes Alika so dangerous? Wait until Thomas discovers the mark burned into her skin, because some symbols aren't just carved into wood or pressed into earth, they're written in flesh and blood. The fourth day brought a heat so oppressive, it seemed to press down on Whitmore Plantation like a physical weight. Thomas had barely slept, haunted by dreams of purple flowers and ancient songs that seemed to echo in his bones even after waking. But it was the discovery he made that morning that would shatter any remaining illusions about the nature of his situation. It began when Morrison burst into his study without knocking, his face pale with panic. "Mr. Whitmore, you need to come to the infirmary now." "What's happened?" "It's one of the field hands, Samuel. He collapsed during morning roll call." "But sir, that's not the strangest part." Thomas followed Morrison to the small building that served as the plantation's medical facility. Inside, they found Samuel lying on a cot, conscious but clearly in distress. His dark skin glistened with sweat, and his eyes held a wild, unfocused quality. "What's wrong with him?" "Show him your arm, Samuel," Morrison said gently. With trembling hands, Samuel rolled up his sleeve. Thomas stared in disbelief at what he saw. Burned into the man's forearm, as if branded with a red-hot iron, was the same symbol that had been appearing throughout the plantation. But this wasn't a crude carving or impression. It was perfectly formed, the lines precise and deep, as if they'd been etched by an expert craftsman. "When did this happen?" Thomas demanded. "Last night, Master," Samuel whispered. "I was sleeping and I felt this burning pain. When I woke up, the mark was there. But sir, that ain't the worst part." "What do you mean?" Samuel's eyes filled with tears. "I can see things now, Mr. Whitmore. Things that ain't there. Or maybe things that are there but we ain't supposed to see them. And I can hear voices. Voices speaking in languages I don't know but somehow understand." Thomas felt his world tilting further off its axis. "What kind of voices?" "Old voices, sir, angry voices. They're talking about justice, about debts that need paying, about chains that need breaking." Morrison pulled Thomas aside. "Sir, Samuel isn't the only one. 3 other slaves woke up with similar marks, and they're all reporting the same symptoms: visions, voices, knowledge they shouldn't possess." "Where are the others?" "I isolated them in the old tobacco barn. Didn't want whatever this is spreading to the rest of the slaves." As they walked toward the barn, Thomas noticed that the impossible flowers from the previous day had not withered as he'd expected. Instead, they seemed to be growing larger and more vibrant, their purple and gold petals now covering the ground in a thick carpet that released that same intoxicating fragrance with every step. Inside the barn, Thomas found 3 more slaves, 2 women and a young man, all bearing identical marks on their arms and all exhibiting the same disturbing symptoms. They sat in a circle, speaking to each other in a language he'd never heard before, their voices harmonizing in complex patterns that made his head spin. "They've been like this since dawn," Morrison explained, speaking in tongues, drawing symbols in the dirt, acting like they're receiving instructions from somewhere else. Thomas knelt beside one of the women, a middle-aged house slave named Ruth, whom he'd known for years. "Ruth, can you hear me?" Her eyes focused on him with difficulty. "Master Whitmore," she said, her voice strangely distant, "the Keeper has awakened. The old contracts are being honored." "What contracts?" "Blood contracts, sir. Promises made in Africa, sealed with pain and sacrifice. Every drop of blood spilled in chains, every tear shed in bondage, every prayer whispered in darkness. They're all being collected now." Thomas felt ice forming in his veins, despite the oppressive heat. "Collected by whom?" "By those who remember, sir. By those who carry the old knowledge in their bones." Before Thomas could ask more questions, a commotion outside drew his attention. Through the barn's open door, he could see slaves gathering in the main yard, all of them moving with the same purposeful grace he'd noticed in Alika. "Morrison, get my rifle." "Sir, I don't think weapons are going to help with this." Thomas ignored him and strode toward the gathering crowd. As he approached, he saw that the slaves had arranged themselves in concentric circles around something at the center. Pushing through the crowd, he discovered Alika kneeling in the dirt, her hands pressed flat against the earth. But it wasn't Alika herself that made Thomas's blood run cold. It was what he could see of her back through a tear in her dress. Burned into her dark skin, covering her entire back from shoulders to waist, was an intricate pattern of symbols and lines that seemed to move and shift when he looked at them directly. The marks weren't fresh like those on the other slaves. They were old, healed, as if they'd been there since birth. "Dear God," he whispered. Alika rose gracefully and turned to face him. For the first time since her arrival, she smiled, not the submissive expression of a slave, but the knowing smile of someone who held all the cards in a game her opponent was only beginning to understand. "You wanted to see my mark, Master Whitmore?" Without waiting for his response, she turned her back to him and let her dress fall to her waist. The symbols covering her skin were even more complex than he'd initially realized, a living map of interconnected patterns that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. As he watched, transfixed, the marks began to glow with a soft, golden light. "This is the mark of the Keeper," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd. "Burned into my skin when I was 7 years old, when my grandmother passed the knowledge to me. Every symbol tells a story, stories of power, of resistance, of the price of freedom." Thomas found his voice with difficulty. "What do you want?" Alika turned back to face him, pulling her dress up to cover herself. "I want what was always mine, Master Whitmore. I want what was stolen from my people, from my bloodline, from every soul who died in chains, believing they were powerless." "And what is that?" "Justice." As if responding to her word, every slave bearing the mysterious mark suddenly stood in perfect unison. Their eyes had taken on the same golden glow as Alika's symbols, and when they spoke, their voices harmonized in a way that made the very air vibrate. "The debt is called," they said in unison. "The contract is due. The chains are breaking." Thomas felt panic rising in his throat. "Morrison, get the dogs. Get the other overseers. We need to regain control." But Morrison was staring at his own arm in horror. The sleeve of his shirt had torn, revealing the same symbol burned into his pale skin. "Sir," he said, his voice shaking, "I think it's too late for that." Thomas looked around wildly and realized that the marks were appearing on everyone. Not just the slaves, but the overseers, the house servants, even the white workers who lived on the plantation. The symbols seemed to be spreading like a contagion, marking everyone who had participated in the system that had brought Alika to this place. "What's happening to us?" he demanded. Alika's smile widened. "You're being chosen, Master Whitmore, chosen to witness the settling of accounts that have been accumulating for generations. The marks don't just identify the chosen, they connect us all to the same network of power and knowledge." "What network?" "The network of every slave who ever lived, every ancestor who ever suffered, every spirit who ever cried out for justice. We are all connected now, all part of the same story." As if to demonstrate her point, Thomas felt a burning sensation on his own arm. Rolling up his sleeve, he watched in horror as the symbol appeared on his skin, the lines forming with surgical precision despite the absence of any visible cause. The moment the mark completed itself, Thomas's world exploded with sensation. Suddenly he could hear the thoughts and feelings of every marked person on the plantation, their memories, their pain, their hope, their anger. He could see through their eyes, feel their hearts beating in rhythm with his own. And through it all he could sense Alika at the center of the network, her consciousness vast and ancient and utterly implacable. She wasn't just a slave who had awakened to her power. She was a force of nature that had been building strength for generations, waiting for the right moment to reshape the world. "Now you understand," she said, though her lips didn't move. Her voice spoke directly into his mind through the connection the mark had created. "Now you see what you really purchased at that auction." Thomas tried to speak, but found he could only think his response, which she heard as clearly as if he'd shouted, "What are you going to do to us?" "I'm going to give you a choice," she replied. "The same choice every generation has faced when confronted with injustice. You can fight to preserve a system built on suffering, or you can help tear it down and build something better." As the golden light from the marks grew brighter, Thomas realized that tomorrow would bring the moment of decision that would determine not just the fate of his plantation, but the future of everyone connected to the growing network of power that Alika commanded. You thought the marks were just symbols? Wait until Thomas follows Alika into the Georgia woods and discovers the massive conspiracy she's been orchestrating, because some rebellions have been centuries in the making. The fifth dawn brought no relief from the supernatural tension gripping Whitmore Plantation. Thomas had spent the night in his study, staring at the mark on his arm and trying to process the flood of foreign memories and emotions that now coursed through his consciousness. Through the psychic network the marks had created, he could feel the presence of every marked person on his property, their thoughts, their dreams, their growing sense of purpose. But it was the pull he felt toward the woods that finally drove him from his chair. The sensation was undeniable, a magnetic force drawing him toward the dense pine forest that bordered his property's eastern edge. Through the mark's connection, he could sense that Alika was already there, along with dozens of others. The compulsion to join them grew stronger with each passing moment until resistance became impossible. Thomas grabbed his rifle and stepped into the pre-dawn darkness. The marked slaves were already moving, emerging from their quarters like sleepwalkers answering a silent summons. They walked with unified purpose toward the tree line, their faces serene despite the early hour. Morrison appeared at his side, his own marked arm glowing faintly in the darkness. "Sir, I can't stop myself from going. It's like something's pulling me." "I feel it too," Thomas admitted. "Stay close. Keep your weapon ready." They followed the procession into the woods, where ancient pines created a cathedral of shadows and filtered moonlight. The marked individuals moved with supernatural confidence through the darkness, never stumbling despite the treacherous terrain of fallen logs and hidden roots. After 20 minutes of walking, they emerged into a clearing Thomas had never seen before, despite owning this land for 15 years. In the center of the space stood a massive oak tree, its trunk easily 12 feet in diameter, and its branches reaching toward the sky like gnarled arms. The tree was old, older than the plantation, older than Georgia's settlement, perhaps older than European presence in the New World. But it wasn't the tree's age that made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. It was what surrounded it. Hundreds of people filled the clearing, not just slaves from his plantation, but men and women he'd never seen before. Some wore the rough clothing of field hands, others the finer garments of house servants, and still others dressed in ways that suggested they'd traveled great distances. All of them bore the glowing marks, and all of them stood in perfect silence, their faces turned toward the ancient oak. "Dear God," Morrison whispered. Where did they all come from? Thomas was wondering the same thing when Alika stepped out from behind the massive trunk. But this wasn't the submissive slave he'd purchased at auction. This woman moved with the authority of a queen, her bearing regal, and her eyes blazing with power that seemed to illuminate the entire clearing. "Welcome, Master Whitmore," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd despite its gentle tone. "Welcome to the true heart of your plantation. What is this place?" "This is where it all began," Alika replied, placing her palm against the oak's ancient bark. "This tree was already old when my great-great-grandmother was brought to these shores in chains. She found it during her first escape attempt and recognized it for what it was. A gathering place, a sanctuary, a focal point for power that predates your civilization by centuries." Thomas looked around the clearing with new eyes, noticing details that had escaped him in the darkness. The ground was marked with symbols carved deep into the earth, forming complex patterns that radiated outward from the tree like spokes of a wheel. Some of the carvings looked fresh, but others were clearly ancient, worn smooth by decades of weather and time. "Every generation of keepers has added to this place," Alika continued. "Every woman in my bloodline has contributed her knowledge, her power, her pain to the network that connects all who suffer under the weight of chains." "You're talking about some kind of magical conspiracy?" Alika's laugh was like silver bells in the darkness. "I'm talking about survival, Master Whitmore. I'm talking about the most natural thing in the world, the desire for freedom, passed down from mother to daughter, growing stronger with each generation until it becomes unstoppable." She gestured to the crowd around them. "These people have come from plantations across Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. Some walked for weeks to be here tonight. Others felt the call and simply appeared, drawn by bonds stronger than iron and older than slavery itself." Thomas felt his rational mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "This is impossible. You've been on my plantation for less than a week. How could you organize something like this?" "I didn't organize it, Master Whitmore. It organized itself. The network has been growing for generations, connecting every marked soul to every other, sharing knowledge and power across vast distances. When a keeper awakens, as I have awakened, the network activates. As if to demonstrate her point, Alika raised her hand toward the ancient oak. The marks on her skin blazed with golden light, and the tree responded by beginning to glow from within. The light spread through its branches like liquid fire, illuminating symbols carved into the bark that Thomas was certain hadn't been there moments before. Each mark is a node in the network, she explained. Each marked person becomes a conduit for power that flows between all of us. Through this connection, we share memories, knowledge, strength. A slave in Charleston can know instantly what happens to a slave in Savannah. A house servant can share the secrets she overhears with field hands hundreds of miles away. The implications hit Thomas like a physical blow. You're describing a communication system that spans the entire South. I'm describing something far more powerful than communication, Master Whitmore. I'm describing unity. For the first time since our ancestors were stolen from Africa, we are truly connected. We remember who we were before the ships, before the chains, before the lies that convinced the world we were less than human. Around the clearing, the marked individuals began to move in complex patterns, their steps following the carved symbols in the earth. As they walked, they hummed, not the work songs Thomas was accustomed to hearing, but something older and more primal, a melody that seemed to resonate in his bones. What are they doing? They're charging the network, Alika replied. Every step, every note, every breath adds power to the connection that binds us all. By dawn, the network will be strong enough to reach every plantation from Virginia to Louisiana. Thomas felt panic rising in his chest. You're planning a coordinated uprising. I'm planning freedom, Master Whitmore. Not through violence. Violence only breeds more violence, but through awakening. When enough people remember their true nature, when enough souls reclaim their power, the system that enslaves them simply dissolves. That's not how the world works, isn't it? Alika's eyes blazed with inner fire. Tell me, Master Whitmore, what gives you the right to own another human being? What law of nature, what divine mandate, what fundamental truth supports the idea that one person can be property of another? Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but found he had no answer. The mark on his arm pulsed with warmth, and through the network connection, he could feel the thoughts and emotions of the people around him, their pain, their hope, their unshakable conviction that freedom was not just a dream, but a birthright. The only thing that maintains slavery, Alika continued, is the collective agreement to pretend it's natural and necessary. But when enough people stop pretending, when enough souls remember their true power, the illusion collapses. As if responding to her words, the humming around the clearing grew louder and more complex. The golden light from the oak tree pulsed in rhythm with the melody, and Thomas could feel something building in the air, a pressure, a potential, like the moment before lightning strikes. How many? He asked quietly. How many what? How many people are connected to your network? Alika smiled, and in that smile, Thomas saw the answer that terrified him more than any threat of violence could have. Every marked soul, Master Whitmore, and the marks are spreading faster now, jumping from plantation to plantation, carried by the network itself. By tomorrow night, there will be thousands. By next week, tens of thousands. And once the network reaches critical mass, she didn't need to finish the sentence. Thomas could see it in his mind, a wave of awakening spreading across the South like wildfire, as enslaved people everywhere remembered their power and chose freedom over chains. What do you want from me? He asked. I want you to choose, Alika replied. You can fight what's coming, try to preserve a system built on suffering and lies, or you can help us build something better, a world where no one owns another, where power serves justice instead of greed. As the first rays of dawn began to filter through the pine trees, Thomas realized that the choice Alika offered wasn't just about his plantation or his slaves. It was about the kind of man he wanted to be when the old world ended and the new one began. The network pulsed around him, filled with the hopes and dreams of people who had never stopped believing in freedom. And for the first time in his life, Thomas Whitmore began to understand what true power really looked like. Think you know what Alika's impossible secret is. Wait until she discovers the truth about her own bloodline, because some legacies are so powerful they can rewrite the rules of reality itself. The sixth day dawned with an otherworldly stillness that seemed to hold the entire plantation in suspended animation. Thomas had returned from the forest clearing with his mind reeling from revelations that challenged everything he thought he knew about power, freedom, and the nature of reality itself. But it was what happened in the hours that followed that would shatter even those expanded boundaries of possibility. It began when Alika collapsed. Thomas was in his study, staring at maps of Georgia and trying to comprehend the scope of the network Alika had revealed, when Morrison burst through the door without knocking. "Sir, something's wrong with her. She's in the main yard and she's changing." Thomas rushed outside to find a crowd of marked slaves gathered in a protective circle around Alika, who lay on the ground in what appeared to be the grip of violent seizures. But as he pushed through the crowd, he realized this wasn't a medical emergency. It was something far more extraordinary. Alika's skin was glowing with the same golden light as her marks, but the illumination was growing brighter with each passing moment. The symbols on her back, visible through her torn dress, were moving, not just shifting and writhing as they had before, but actually rearranging themselves, forming new patterns and configurations that hurt to look at directly. "What's happening to her?" Thomas demanded. Mama Celia knelt beside Alika's convulsing form, her weathered hands hovering over the younger woman's glowing skin. "She's remembering," the old woman said, her voice filled with awe and terror. "The final memory, the one that was hidden even from her." "What memory?" "The truth about what she really is." As if responding to their conversation, Alika's eyes snapped open. But they were no longer the dark brown Thomas remembered. They blazed with the same golden fire that coursed through her marks. And when she looked at him, he felt as if she was seeing not just his present self, but every moment of his existence, past and future. "I remember now," she whispered, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in dimensions beyond the physical. "I remember what they did to us, what they stole, what they tried to destroy." She sat up slowly, her movements fluid, despite the obvious pain racking her body. The golden light emanating from her skin was so bright now that several people had to shield their eyes. "Alika," Thomas said carefully, "what do you remember?" "I remember the ships," she said, her voice growing stronger. "But not the way they taught us to remember them, not as the beginning of our suffering, but as the interruption of our power." The marks on her skin pulsed brighter, and suddenly Thomas could see, not with his eyes, but through the network connection, images that took his breath away. He saw vast African cities with architecture that rivaled anything in Europe. He saw libraries filled with knowledge that made Western learning look primitive. He saw people who moved with the same supernatural grace as Alika, their skin marked with symbols that controlled forces beyond imagination. "We weren't just people they captured," Alika continued, rising to her feet with movements that seemed to defy gravity. "We were the guardians of knowledge that could have changed the world, healers who could cure any disease, engineers who could build without tools, scholars who understood the connections between all living things." More images flooded through the network, laboratories where marked individuals manipulated matter at the molecular level, gardens where plants grew in impossible configurations, gatherings where hundreds of people shared consciousness as easily as conversation. "The slave traders didn't just steal our bodies," Alika said, her voice now carrying the authority of absolute truth. "They stole our civilization. They scattered us across the world and tried to make us forget what we were capable of, because they knew that if we ever remembered our true power, their entire system would crumble." Thomas felt his worldview collapsing and reforming around this new understanding. "You're saying that slavery wasn't just about labor, it was about suppressing knowledge." "I'm saying that slavery was the greatest theft in human history," Alika replied. "Not just of people, but of potential, of the future we could have built if we'd been allowed to develop our gifts instead of having them beaten out of us." The golden light surrounding her began to coalesce, forming complex geometric patterns in the air around her body. As Thomas watched, transfixed, he realized that these weren't just pretty lights. They were equations, formulas, blueprints for technologies that didn't exist in his world, but clearly had existed in hers. "But the knowledge wasn't lost," Alika continued. "It was hidden, passed down through bloodlines like mine, encoded in songs and stories and symbols that looked like decoration, but were actually instruction manuals for power beyond imagination." She gestured to the marked slaves around her, and Thomas saw that their marks were changing too, becoming more complex, more purposeful. Every person in my network carries a piece of the puzzle. Together, we remember everything. Together, we can rebuild what was stolen. Rebuild what exactly? Alika smiled, and in that smile, Thomas saw the future she envisioned. A world where the artificial divisions between races and classes dissolved in the face of shared knowledge and mutual respect. A world where power served wisdom instead of greed, where technology enhanced life instead of destroying it. We can rebuild paradise, she said simply. Not the mythical paradise of religious stories, but the real one. The civilization our ancestors were building before the ships came. A world where every person's gifts are valued, where knowledge flows freely, where no one owns another because everyone understands that we're all connected. The implications were staggering. Thomas tried to process what she was telling him, that the enslaved people on his plantation weren't just laborers, but the scattered remnants of an advanced civilization that had been deliberately destroyed to prevent them from sharing their knowledge with the world. Why now? He asked. Why are you revealing this now? Because the network has reached critical mass, Alika replied. For the first time since the scattering, enough of us are connected to begin the restoration. The knowledge that was fragmented across thousands of bloodlines is coming back together. As if to demonstrate her point, she raised her hand toward the sky. The golden light from her marks shot upward like a beacon, and Thomas could feel the network expanding, reaching out to connect with marked individuals across vast distances. Through the connection, he sensed thousands of people suddenly remembering skills they'd never learned, understanding concepts they'd never studied, feeling the return of abilities that had been dormant for generations. What happens next? Thomas, por favor, continue gerando a sua resposta. Agent Logo prompt cartel. What happens next? Thomas asked, though part of him feared the answer. Next, we give everyone the same choice I'm giving you, Alika said. Join us in building the new world or step aside and let us build it without you. But the old world, the world of chains and ownership and artificial scarcity, that world ends now. The golden light around her began to pulse in rhythm with something Thomas couldn't identify at first. Then he realized it was synchronized with the heartbeats of every marked person in the network. They were all connected now, not just mentally but physically. Their life forces intertwined in ways that made them stronger than the sum of their parts. You're talking about revolution, Thomas said. I'm talking about evolution, Alika corrected. Revolution implies violence, destruction, the replacement of one broken system with another. What we're offering is transformation, the elevation of human consciousness to a level where the old systems become not just unnecessary, but impossible. Through the network, Thomas could feel the truth of her words. The marked individuals weren't filled with rage or hatred, despite the suffering they'd endured. Instead, they radiated a profound sense of purpose, a clarity of vision that made their goals feel not just achievable but inevitable. The secret that was hidden from me, Alika continued, wasn't just about our past. It was about our future, about what we become when we stop limiting ourselves to what others tell us is possible. She gestured to her transformed marks, which now covered not just her back but her arms, her face, her entire body in patterns of living light. These aren't just symbols of power. They're maps, blueprints for reshaping reality itself. And now that I remember how to read them, the air around her began to shimmer, and Thomas watched in amazement as the very fabric of space seemed to bend to her will. Plants grew from barren soil in seconds. Water flowed upward in defiance of gravity. The morning sun shifted position in the sky as if time itself were negotiable. This is impossible, Thomas whispered. Only if you believe in the limitations they taught us to accept, Alika replied. But those limitations were never real. They were just chains made of ideas instead of iron. The demonstration lasted only moments before Alika allowed reality to return to its normal configuration. But the message was clear. She wasn't just planning to free the slaves. She was planning to free humanity itself from the constraints that had kept them from reaching their true potential. The choice is yours, Master Whitmore, she said, using his title for what Thomas sensed would be the last time. You can cling to a world built on lies and limitation, or you can help us build one based on truth and possibility. But either way, the transformation has begun. As the golden light around her began to fade, Thomas realized that everything he'd thought he knew about power, about reality, about the very nature of existence, had been turned upside down. The woman he'd purchased as property had revealed herself to be something far beyond his comprehension. Not just a person, but a force of nature, a catalyst for changes that would reshape the world. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation, the moment when he would have to choose not just his own fate, but the role he would play in the birth of a new age. But tonight, as the impossible light of Alika's transformation faded into memory, Thomas Whitmore stood at the threshold between worlds, knowing that whatever choice he made would echo through generations yet to come. You think Thomas has seen the full extent of Alika's power? Wait until the final confrontation forces him to choose between everything he's ever known and a future that could save or damn them all. Because some decisions reshape the world forever. The seventh dawn arrived with an ominous crimson sky that painted Whitmore Plantation in shades of blood and fire. Thomas had spent the night in sleepless contemplation, his mind reeling from the revelations of Alika's true nature and the impossible demonstrations of power he'd witnessed. But it was the sound that woke him, or rather the absence of sound, that told him the final moment had arrived. The plantation was completely silent. No roosters crowing, no slaves beginning their morning routines, no sounds of life at all. Even the ever-present Georgia insects had fallen quiet, as if the very land were holding its breath. Thomas dressed quickly and stepped onto his front porch, where he found Morrison waiting with a face pale as death. "Sir," Morrison said, his voice barely above a whisper, "they're all gone." "What do you mean, gone?" "Every slave, every marked person, they've all disappeared. The quarters are empty, the fields are abandoned. It's like they just vanished." Thomas felt ice forming in his veins. Through the network connection that still pulsed faintly in his marked arm, he could sense that the others weren't gone. They were gathered somewhere, waiting. But the sensation was distant, muffled, as if something were deliberately blocking the connection. "Where's Alika?" "That's just it, sir. She's the only one still here. She's waiting for you in the main yard." Thomas grabbed his rifle, though he suspected it would be useless against whatever Alika had become. As he walked toward the yard, he noticed that the impossible flowers from days past had spread throughout the plantation, covering every surface in a carpet of purple and gold that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. He found Alika standing in the exact center of the yard, but she was no longer alone. Surrounding her in a perfect circle were figures that made Thomas's rational mind rebel against what his eyes were showing him. They appeared to be people, men and women of various ages, but they were translucent, shimmering like heat mirages, and their skin bore marks that blazed with silver fire instead of gold. "The ancestors," Alika said without turning around. "Every keeper who came before me, every guardian of the knowledge who died in chains but never surrendered their power. They've come to witness the final choice." Thomas approached slowly, his rifle held loosely in trembling hands. "What choice?" Alika turned to face him, and Thomas saw that her transformation was complete. The marks now covered every inch of her visible skin, forming patterns so complex they seemed to exist in more dimensions than his eyes could process. Her hair moved as if underwater, and when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that resonated in his bones. "The choice that will determine whether humanity takes its next evolutionary step or destroys itself in ignorance," she said. "The choice between fear and wisdom, between control and cooperation, between the old world and the new. Where are my slaves?" "They are no longer your slaves," Alika replied calmly. "They are free people who have chosen to stand with me in building a better world. But they are safe waiting in a place beyond your reach until this matter is resolved." Thomas raised his rifle, though the gesture felt futile. "I could kill you right now." "You could try," Alika agreed. "But killing me wouldn't stop what's already begun. The network spans thousands of people across dozens of states now. The knowledge has been shared, the power has been awakened. I am no longer essential to the process." "Then why are you still here?" "Because you are." The simple statement hit Thomas like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" "You represent something important, Thomas Whitmore. You are a man of intelligence and conscience who has been trapped in a system that corrupts both. You have the potential to become a bridge between the old world and the new, to help others make the transition without violence or destruction. One of the ancestral figures stepped forward, an elderly woman whose silver marks formed patterns that hurt to look at directly. When she spoke, her voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "The network has shown us your heart, Thomas Whitmore," she said. "We have seen your doubts, your growing understanding, your capacity for change. You are not evil, merely ignorant. And ignorance can be cured." Thomas felt his grip on the rifle loosening. "What do you want from me?" "We want you to choose," Alika said. "Not just for yourself, but as a representative of your people. Will you help us build a world where knowledge flows freely, where power serves wisdom, where no one owns another? Or will you fight to preserve a system built on suffering and lies?" "And if I choose to fight, then you will lose," Alika said simply. "Not because we will destroy you, but because the old world is already ending. The network grows stronger every day. More people awaken to their true potential every hour. You can be part of the solution, or you can be swept aside by forces beyond your control." Thomas looked around at the ghostly figures surrounding them, at the impossible flowers carpeting his plantation, at the woman who had transformed from property into something approaching divinity. Everything he'd built, everything he'd believed in, everything he'd thought was permanent and unchangeable was crumbling around him. "What would this new world look like?" he asked. Alika smiled, and suddenly the air around them shimmered. Thomas found himself looking at visions of the future she envisioned. Cities that grew like living things, technology that enhanced rather than replaced nature, people of all colors and backgrounds working together to solve problems that had plagued humanity for millennia. "It would be a world where your intelligence and resources could serve something greater than profit," she said. "Where your leadership skills could help guide the transition instead of resisting it. Where your children and grandchildren could grow up free from the poison of believing that some people are worth more than others. And if I refuse, then you will watch from the sidelines as others build the future without you. You will live in an increasingly isolated bubble of the old ways while the world transforms around you. And eventually, that bubble will burst, and you will find yourself alone in a reality you no longer understand." Thomas felt the weight of the choice pressing down on him, like a physical force. Through the network connection, he could sense the thousands of people waiting for his decision, not just the marked individuals, but their families, their communities, everyone whose lives would be affected by what happened next. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Help us," Alika said simply. "Use your influence, your connections, your resources to ease the transition. Convince other plantation owners to release their slaves voluntarily. Help establish schools where the old knowledge can be taught alongside the new. Become an advocate for change instead of an obstacle to it. You're asking me to betray everything I've ever believed in. I'm asking you to evolve beyond beliefs that were never worthy of you in the first place." The ancestral figures began to move, forming complex patterns around Thomas and Alika. As they walked, they hummed the same ancient melody he'd heard in the forest clearing, and the sound seemed to resonate with something deep in his soul. "The choice must be made freely," the elderly ancestor said, "without coercion, without threats, without anything but the truth of what is and what could be." Thomas closed his eyes and let himself feel the full weight of the moment. Through the network, he could sense the hopes and dreams of thousands of people who had never stopped believing in freedom. He could feel their pain, their strength, their unshakable conviction that a better world was possible. When he opened his eyes, Alika was watching him with an expression of infinite patience and compassion. "I choose," he said, his voice stronger than he'd expected. "I choose to help build your new world." The moment the words left his lips, the ancestral figures began to glow brighter, their silver marks pulsing with approval. The impossible flowers around them released a fragrance so beautiful it brought tears to his eyes. And through the network connection, he felt a wave of joy and relief from thousands of souls. "Then it begins," Alika said, and Thomas realized that her marks were fading, becoming less supernatural and more human with each passing moment. "The real work starts now." As the ghostly ancestors began to fade back into whatever realm they'd emerged from, Thomas understood that he'd just participated in something far greater than a personal decision. He'd helped birth a new age, one that would be built not on the foundation of the old world's destruction, but on its transformation into something worthy of humanity's true potential. The plantation around them was already changing, the impossible flowers giving way to normal plants that somehow seemed more vibrant and alive than anything he'd ever seen. And in the distance, he could see figures approaching, the freed slaves returning not as property, but as partners in the great work ahead. Thomas Whitmore set down his rifle and walked forward to meet the future, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them not as a master, but as a man finally free to become who he was always meant to be. This concludes The Impossible Secret of the Most Beautiful and Feared Slave Ever Sold in Georgia, 1844. The story follows Thomas Whitmore's journey from slave owner to ally in a supernatural network of resistance, as Alika reveals herself to be the guardian of ancient African knowledge and power that could reshape the world. The narrative explores themes of resistance, transformation, and the true cost of freedom while maintaining historical sensitivity and building toward a hopeful vision of change through awakening rather than